10 years from now, we won't be talking about questions like, do you have to be an engineer or be super technically strong to have a meaningful impact in the space world?
That was Sita Sonty, the new CEO of Space Tango, and I'm Emma Robinson, one of the co-hosts of Wharton Tech Talks. With that quote, I'd like to introduce the first official episode of our new series on the space industry. Our goal with this series is to make space more accessible to our non-technical listeners, but also highlight the business aspects of space for our technical listeners. This series will continue throughout the rest of the year, so stay tuned. To start off the series, we are lucky enough to have Sita joining us to push the boundaries of space innovation. Imagine a world where organs are printed in the vastness of space. Sounds like science fiction? Well, it might be closer to reality than you think. Join us to learn more about that future and continue to listen also to learn more about the need for diversity in the space industry. Space Tango also has an upcoming launch aboard the SpaceX CRS-29, so keep an eye out in the news for that. It should hopefully be within a week of this episode, but launch dates can always change. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Sita Sonty. We're so happy to have you on the podcast. Congratulations on becoming the new CEO of Space Tango. To start off, could you just tell us a little bit about Space Tango, what the business does in layman's terms?
Absolutely, and thank you. So what does Space Tango do in layman's terms? If you can imagine taking a box about the size of a microwave, and inside that box, you can not only control temperature, which is what we're used to imagining happens in microwaves. When you put in the food, you increase the temperature. Except instead of just controlling the temperature, you're also controlling the pressure. You're controlling convection and buoyancy. Essentially 4 scientific factors that when you control for them can create a more natural environment for what you could call organic material to just grow. For example, a lot of the stuff that we actually send up in these microwave-sized boxes, which we lovingly called cube labs, tends to be healthcare in orientation. We send up organoids, which is essentially an organ-on-chip technology. Think hearts, kidneys, livers, that sort of thing, brains as well. We send up stem cell cultures in order to determine when you actually control for these scientific factors in a microgravity environment, how does that stem cell culture change? And we've done a lot of drug discovery research inside those microwave-sized boxes that we call cube labs. We've done this 261 times, which is pretty amazing, and counting. And the place where we do it, where those boxes go, is familiar to most folks. It's the International Space Station. What's cool about our design is that everything that we do is automated. So short of an astronaut taking the box out of a capsule, putting it into a rack on the ISS, everything else does not require manual manipulation. It's all run out of our headquarters in Lexington, Kentucky.
So for those who may be a little bit less science-oriented, a little more technically challenged, what is so special about doing this in space, and why can't some of this stuff be done down on Earth?
No, this is actually a really good question. It can be done on Earth. There are, in fact, what we call microgravity simulators. And I think, Emma, the question behind your question is, isn't it cheaper to do it on Earth? If we can get to the same result with less cost of going up to space, then why not just do that? Historically, that's actually been the case. So there are a handful of microgravity simulator environments, or simulated microgravity environments is a better way to capture it, where they're essentially labs in Earth where you try to control for some of these scientific factors that in microgravity are much easier to control for. The problem is when you introduce unnatural materials where the object itself, that organ on chip or that stem cell culture, is not floating, then think about it. The organ on chip or that stem cell culture is going to interact. When we interact with plastics, when there's this whole movement towards clean hygiene, clean goods, clean dishwasher, so clean this, clean that, even that movement, it's based on the fundamental scientific premise that if there are artificial agents that come into contact with the organic agent, it has a reaction. The microgravity simulator is not the same thing as actual microgravity. That's one of the scientific differences, because you're actually allowing those stem cell cultures or the organ on chips to float. The other thing I wanted to mention is the unit economics. Again, the question behind your question. Yeah, historically, it's been very expensive and very limiting to access space. However, with the advent of reusability in launch vehicles, particularly with the Falcon 9 by SpaceX, we now have more opportunity to get up to the ISS, which is the existing location. And the price per kilogram has just come down so significantly that the value proposition of leveraging that microgravity environment as opposed to a simulated microgravity environment here on Earth has become more favorable for real research that's at the scalable level. I mean, you can only get so far when you mix a stem cell culture with a plastic here on Earth. And so now, because the unit economics based on launch have come down enough to the point of commoditization, it's enabled the utilization at a more effective rate in orbit.
Yeah, one of the themes of our space series has just been the turning point in recent years with the ease of launching things to space and how that has just enabled a much wider variety of industries and normal people who don't know space could have ever imagined. If you could think 10 years down the line, what is the dream goal for this technology, or what is the coolest future that you envision?
I think the dream goal and the coolest future are one and the same for me, which is that we will get to a scalable physical environment where we can produce artificial retinas. Those artificial retinas are brought back down and brought into essentially a standardization of ophthalmological support for those for whom retina replacement is the right healthcare outcome. Same thing with the in-space manufacturing of other organoids for other organ development or other organ benefits, such as heart tissue or kidney tissue or liver tissue. Someone was telling me, one of our principal investigators and a great scientist out of the University of California in San Francisco, was saying what I now know to be almost common knowledge, which is that we don't necessarily need our entire liver for the liver to perform its function. We don't need all of its actual mass. Well, you also think about the sort of economic size of liver transplants and how much there's a shortage of livers to provide those transplants, and the economic value of, or really the economic loss of, the impact of liver disease. So to be able to create liver tissue samples that then turn into actual liver replacement samples, that's both super cool and really meaningful, and without question in our future.
That's amazing. One of the things when people ask me, like, what is the coolest thing I've heard about going on in space is just the potential future of curing so many diseases and 3D printing organs is how I've been calling it. But perhaps what I'm learning is that's not the right language necessarily, but that's one of the reasons that drew me to reach out to Space Tango and bring you on the show. So before we dive a little bit more into the business model, could you tell us a little bit about your background and the journey that led you to this role and what it's been like to take over as CEO?
Absolutely. I'll just confess my journey is not linear by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a career Foreign Service officer, and I was in the Foreign Service for, I think, almost 18 years by the time I ended. And what was interesting was there was still enough interface with, I would say, the national security side of aerospace and defense. I would put Space Tango and a lot of what we were just talking about on the commercial or civil side. That's sort of how that transition occurred, or why it occurred, really. I participated in a lot of negotiations on foreign military sales, which is the transfer of sensitive technology that's made for the aerospace by the aerospace and defense industry, but for aerospace and defense application by the US government and armed services. But quite often we have allies. And with those allies, this can be a very powerful tool in the foreign policy toolkit. There's also sensitive limitations on what technology we can share and what technology we should share and who are we contending with together. When I joined the State Department, our sort of adversarial posture in warfighting is very different from what it is today. I joined right after 9/11. Today, the talk is about the great power competition. However, what's interesting is aerospace and defense technologies, you can think about them as for kinetic purpose, as I mentioned, my precision-guided munition or a missile. Well, over the arc of time and in my career from Raytheon to Sierra Nevada Corporation and then to SpaceX, I was able to gain an understanding of and also lead some negotiations of the transfer of those technologies for a commercial or civil application. On the civil side, it's the kind of work that Space Tango has done so well. 261 payloads and counting. We've got our next launch coming up in 10 days on SpaceX 29. We're really excited. And in effect, it is this research platform that historically has been sponsored by the civil agencies of the United States government. Here we're talking NASA. We're also talking about NIH and the National Science Foundation to promote this kind of research. The commercial value application is interesting too, because what if there's actually a shortening of the timeline for clinical trial for a drug, and that shortening of that timeline to clinical trial for that drug depends on the utilization of a microgravity research environment? That's a commercial model, commercial application, but you're still using fundamentally the hardware, which is a box, and hardware in orbit is called a satellite. It's interesting to see that there's actually a lot more cross-pollination of capability in the space industry or the space segment of the overall aerospace industry. You just have to be super creative and think about, well, okay, this is what I'm designing this for, this great innovative technology for commercial application. Maybe there's a national security reason that this can be used too, or vice versa. That's been the through line in the career. 18 years in the Foreign Service, Director of National Security at Raytheon, Vice President for Strategy at Sierra Nevada Corporation, and the Head of Human Spaceflight Sales at SpaceX. One final piece I'll mention, I think this will be relevant both for you and maybe some of your listeners. For the last 2 years, I actually was leading the commercial space topic for Boston Consulting Group. BCG is not alone in the consulting industry of not only recognizing the value of the space economy, but also realizing that having a knowledge of the timeline for tech development in space, that's pretty powerful and is very unique, because the timelines to field the capability in space are so different from a lot of the other innovation and tech that's happening out there. So leading the commercial space topic for BCG was really exciting and became very interesting for due diligence efforts and projects for financial institutions, for venture capitalists, for private equity who are saying, we want to invest in this company or this company. Should we? And if so, why? And then how do we protect the downside risks from that investment? That's sort of the through line of the career, and also gives you a sense that if there's interest in the work either that Space Tango as a company does or the overall space industry, if you have a business insight or if you have a technological insight, there's space for everybody here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got interested in space similarly in consulting. Aerospace and defense consulting is my own background, and I agree that there's room for everyone in space. And similar to you, I have more of a policy background rather than a technical background. As you started to get more and more involved in the space industry throughout your career, how did you set yourself up for success despite not having the technical background? And what advice would you have for people specifically wanting to get involved in space or other deep tech industries?
This is a great question. I think the key success factor is admitting what you don't know. And in fact, this was something that was a dominant theme in my foreign service career too, is you're thrown into a new environment or a new industry or a new technology, and you're basically told, okay, go and figure it out to the extent that you can. But then admitting what you don't know on the technological side can be really powerful, because you can then think about, well, where can I add value? I'll just offer from personal experience, to the extent that I did add value in any of these roles, and hopefully some folks would say I have. It's been around the creativity side, by which I mean, what other applications can we seek or serve through this technology? So you're telling me this thing performs this act because of these properties. Okay, well, with the thing, with the widget, because of these properties, could it do use case A? Could it serve use case B? Could it serve use case C? And identifying what those use cases are requires a lot of creativity. I say for those who don't have a technical background like me, the creative side can be really powerful. In parallel, I'll also say quantitative analysis of finances. Oh boy, that's super powerful too. So that's another area where folks like us can definitely have meaningful impact in this industry.
So definitely things that MBAs could aspire to. I think we all know how to find market opportunities and size a market.
Exactly. Size the market, define the set of use cases, and run the Excel spreadsheet, baby.
Yeah, that's something an MBA student is very well versed in. So hopefully, slowly, we're making through this podcast space seem a little bit less intimidating. I think that one way that space still feels a little intimidating to a lot of people is its reputation for being a highly innovative field necessitating big bets, high capital requirements. How do you think about staying competitive and innovative and managing all these financial risks effectively?
That's a great question, too. And yeah, it is both an exceptionally competitive industry and it requires a very high tolerance for risk, simply put. If that's not a personal value set for someone, it's just worth articulating and saying, okay, can I still give it a try? From a broader lens, I would argue the way to be effective in the space industry is actually to be really honest about what innovation you can execute on, how quickly you can do it, and not try to, I would say, feed the hype. A couple of years back, I wrote this op-ed called Space and SPACs, a COVID romance. Back in 2021, the space industry and the space economy was booming. Everybody wanted to invest in company X or company Y. Lots of folks wanted to leverage the SPAC vehicle to do so. I mean, the SPAC vehicle was obviously being leveraged in other economic segments as well. We did this research to actually measure how were SPACs performing with space companies versus other companies. I mean, boy, there were some really great lessons that we came up with in our study, which we ended up publishing in that piece. And one of the major through lines was the time horizon for developing technology in the space industry is not the same pace as a lot of other deep tech. The reason being, we have to survive orbit and we have to survive, generally speaking, re-entry, depending upon the what that is going up into orbit and coming back. To actually test that in a meaningful way and hit your targets, etc., everyone always says space is hard. If anything, the answer to your question is the question itself. From the outside, space is intimidating. From the inside, we all always say space is hard. To be savvy about it, to continue the pace of innovation while mitigating the risks, requires being more realistic about the time horizon to field a capability and to not overpromise and underdeliver. Because that's simple business skills, but in the space industry, that could be a harder nut to crack, I think, for a lot of entrepreneurs.
From a startup perspective, for the sake of for our listeners, we've also discussed something similar with Austin Lincoln Starfish Space and their bet and difficulties and challenges this past summer. So check out that episode if you're interested. But back to this conversation, could you briefly just explain who Space Tango's main customers are at the moment?
Absolutely. And in fact, I want to give a shout out to Austin and to Starfish and to the Otter Pup. I think one of the things that they did this summer, which was to reorient it and reestablish connectivity with it while it was in orbit, that was actually the news story. So he's a good friend of mine, and hopefully he gets a chance to listen to this one. And he knows that he's got the full backing of the space industry because we actually all want each other to succeed. But in terms of the customer base for Space Tango, I'd say it probably comes down to two major groups. One of the groups is those who are developing organoids, the organoid marketplace. And there's, in fact, a very rich set of stakeholders that want to produce more organoids, both for research purposes, but also ultimately to fit into what could be organ replacement down the line. I'd say another big group of customers is oriented around stem cell research. There's an aspiration to send up patient-specific stem cell batches. So imagine a capability where you can send up individual stem cell batches, observe how they mutate in microgravity, and what has been scientifically published quite a bit, analyzed and published, is that microgravity is the most effective simulation environment to simulate aging. You can imagine a world where individual stem cell batches from you, from me, go up to microgravity and stay up there for a long enough period of time to yield meaningful data for what happens to this batch of our body or this batch of our body as we age. That's an entire customer group right there. And then finally, pharma. Because of the principles of microgravity and how microgravity is a solution to a problem from a drug compound standpoint, if you can control for the properties, you can see how drug compounds act, how they behave in a more rapid environment that yields more insight. That data and that intellectual property is very powerful and can shorten the timeline for clinical trial for the development of certain drugs. So even a lot of our compadres in the space industry are fielding drug labs, essentially, that are in orbit. And it's very powerful. And those are our customers, too. I mean, we don't see each other as competition because, as I said, our whole objective is for the entire industry to prosper and to flourish. But I'd say that's another big part of the target segment.
So are it these customers that you've outlined that helped fund Space Tango and get Space Tango off the ground and running? I know you joined only recently, but I'm curious where the initial funding came from that's been able to help and enable Space Tango to scale.
The great history of Space Tango is actually it's a spin-out from the University of Kentucky. And there's an incubator at the University of Kentucky called the Kentucky Space Technology Center, KSTC. And very great kind of mentor and colleague, Chris Kimmel, was one of the co-founders, both of the company, but the spin-out from what was KSTC. We consider KSTC our sort of original partners, and that's its history. So it's pretty amazing that the company's been able to be in existence since I think it was 2016, 17 is when it was founded as a spin-out that was incubated. And we're now at 261 payloads just a handful of years later. That level of scalability is just startup culture at its finest. It's innovation at its finest. I'm lucky enough that I get to come in at this stage and say, okay, we've got this incredible flight heritage. We've got this incredible customer heritage. And the beauty is we built it in a handful of years, as opposed to a company that's been on the ISS for the last 20 years, for example. So if we can get to this scale and this speed, okay, let's put a little extra rocket fuel and add and expand our commercial customer base. Let's go global. So a big push that we're doing at Space Tango is actually developing international partnerships, because I think that's absolutely key. And as I said, looking at other use cases or other applications for our tech, because the more creative you can be, you'll never know if you don't imagine what that other set of customers could be, unless you actually try to say, well, could we repurpose this for this usage or that usage?
Sounds like another place where an MBA can be useful, hopefully.
Any of your listeners, if you guys want to come over to Space Tango, obviously I'm plug-in, so, find me on LinkedIn.
Well, hopefully someone. All listeners, always feel free to reach out to the team if you're interested in any of our hosts. So is it, for each mission, is it the customer that's kind of fronting the majority of the cost for the launch, or how does that concrete business model look like?
I'll say we have got the best partners in the world at NASA. Historically, in fact, all of what we've done historically has been a combination of launch and a number of the services being funded by NASA, as well as support from grant organizations like the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, and they tend to fund the scientific integration. That's what has been the case historically. That being said, our new business model is anchored around commercial partnerships to really step change, not only scaling up so that we can send up more cube labs, which is our capability today, but actually design a larger form factor, self-sustaining, autonomous capability for the future, not too distant future, leveraging commercial partnerships and investment. We're shifting the model not because we want to change what has actually worked quite well, but we want to build on it. And in fact, that's in full alignment with what NASA has talked about in public domain, which is that the low Earth orbit ecosystem is designed to move in a commercial direction where they don't front the non-recurring engineering costs. We want to work side by side with them and identify what some of those commercial investment vehicles and revenue sources can be.
Yeah, this is a very frequent story, and especially space startups will rely a lot on government agencies and government help for scaling early on, and then hopefully the goal is to transition not purely necessarily, but heavily commercial. So that makes sense. So it seems like Space Tango has, and you mentioned this a little earlier as well, really relied on its and been able to build a very good base of connections across the space industry. How has Space Tango been able to do this? And then personally as well, you've had such an amazing career in a bunch of different companies. How have you continued to leverage your network, or how do you see you leveraging your network for Space Tango now?
Yeah, part of what I said about international customers is entirely an inheritance from my diplomatic career in the Foreign Service, as well as my previous roles. Because, as I said, present of space is very global. The future of space has to be. That's definitely something that I'm trying to transport over the arc of and bring to Space Tango in particular. Same thing applies on the national security side of the house, right? Space Tango is a civil space provider and will become a commercial space provider. We also are on contract with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. My goal is to deliver more of an understanding of the national security applications for Space Tango's capability and provide that as a set of tools that the United States government can use towards its leverage.
Wow. That makes a lot of sense, bringing in that government side connections. So I can see why they brought you on as CEO. For those of us just beginning to build our base of connections, what sort of advice do you have, and what are some key skills that you suggest that we focus on to get where you are?
Definitely take risks early on in your career, because as you become later on in your career, it becomes harder to take them. Not impossible, but you want to have as many reps of failure early on because the stakes are generally a little bit lower. I've heard people coming out of B school or coming out of grad school often, or even coming out of college saying, I don't know if I want to move to that place, or I don't know if that's something that I really want to do right now. My response, and I do a lot of coaching and a lot of mentoring, my response always is, now is the time to take that risk or take that chance. One of the side benefits, to answer more directly your question about developing a rich network, is you're not going to develop the network if you don't take those risks. You will always have the rich network from your business school. You'll always have the rich network from your college. Okay, that's great. Interestingly, in the space industry, there are folks who never went to college or business school. So identifying as many creative sources for that network base as possible is only going to help, which is why I say keep your doors open and keep your mind open. And finally, humility is so important. I've gotten feedback at all kinds of stages of my career about acknowledging what you have done and then acknowledging what you don't know. And in order to develop that really rich network, being humble and being vulnerable when you're meeting new people, whether they're through scholastics or they're through professional experiences or internships or geographies, you will never know how somebody that you met when you were 25 becomes such a key advocate for you when you're in your mid to late 40s. The way that becomes a reality is by staying humble and always being open to that critical feedback from that same network, because that's how you continue to sustain their trust.
Were you ever nervous bouncing between different companies or different industries? I mean, you stayed within kind of the aerospace and defense world for a while, but ever worried, or for someone that's contemplating a career switch, that they're going to lose their entire network and just have to start again? Do you have any advice for just taking that leap and being confident?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it's interesting to hear you say your interpretation of my career, and I'm grateful for that I pretty much stayed in the aerospace and defense industry. For every one of you, there's someone that says, Sita, you've bounced around a lot. That's all perception. It's all in the eyes of the beholder, as they say. It's impossible to sustain the adequate level of confidence if one person looks at your career and says, oh, I get it, that's cool. And another person looks at your career and pokes holes in it and says, you don't have the credibility. That's a confidence killer. I don't really have any genius pearls of wisdom other than remember your core values as an individual first and foremost. Because if you can be confident in your values as an individual, it doesn't matter where you work. It doesn't matter who your customer or who your network is, because the real authentic professional of all of the aspiring leaders that are your listeners, that authenticity only really shines if each one of us knows who we are. Because there's always going to be people out there who question whether you did what you say you did, or whether your career was full of change or not full of change whatsoever. I mean, I'd say it's probably being true to oneself on almost a humanistic level. That is the only thing that can help us sustain confidence, whether you're changing a job, whether you're changing a career, a geography. If you're true to who you are, then hopefully you can drown out the noise of those who don't see you for who you are.
I love that. That's such a great way of looking at things. I know a lot of people come to business school thinking about making a career pivot and then suddenly get nervous they're going to lose the progress they've already made in their career and have to restart, or we get easily caught up in what everyone else is doing. So staying true to your values is good advice, though. sometimes more challenging than it seems.
Definitely. I will just say, as a single mom of two teenagers, I have all opportunities to poke hole in my self-confidence every single day. The same adage applies. It's sort of trust your intuition, trust your gut, and the rest will just have to work itself out. You just keep putting one foot in front of another. But I hear what you're saying, and especially the stage of one's career and the fear of a pivot or the fear of change. It's also just a basic fact of human nature, too. It's not in our nature to absorb tremendous amounts of change, even once, much less constantly. I think it's reasonable to just say, okay, maybe I don't need a change. But as I said, if you're going to have changes in your career in particular, do them early. Take it on early, because as you get older, it becomes much harder to execute.
I mean, it seems like you've taken on a change, becoming the CEO of a startup. Were you scared to take that jump?
1,000%. 1,000%. And the folks at Space Tango know this. I was looking at a couple of other opportunities too. And my son graduates high school in, 2.5 years. My daughter will graduate high school in 4 years and change. So I've got precious days, moments left with them in the house. So this is the worst time to become the CEO of a startup. But that being said, and this may only resonate with some of your listenership, but that's okay with me, the number of CEOs of space companies who are both female and of color is very, very low. So sometimes you serve a mission that is greater than the commercial value of the company. And that was a deciding factor for me. That made me think, okay, if I'm going to take a last risk, let's see, this might be the opportunity, because who else has done this that looks like me, that can create even just a simple visual data point for others who want to feel represented in the arc of their careers. If nothing else, if I can do that for younger professionals, then it was worth it.
Do you have any advice for women, and especially women of color, trying to make it in this industry?
Call me.
That's great advice, and I'm sure honestly very helpful. Sure, you have a lot of great advice to give. Well, we're coming up on time for our podcast, but my last question, I guess I have two actual questions, since how far are we really from being able to print the organs in space? And do you have any other exciting bets on the space industry?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to put the time horizon as conservatively 10 years. I think we can do it sooner than that at a larger scale. And it takes, as we've talked about, the investment, it takes the customers to commit to this is what they want to do in the long term. But yeah, with the right level of investment and with the right customer support, I think we can do it in 10 years. Other exciting innovations in space, I actually was talking about this at a conference just yesterday. I think the intersection of luxury goods in space is a very interesting one, largely because at SpaceX, it was partnerships with luxury companies. Like one of them is sending up champagne in space to see how does it change. But then when you bring it back to Earth, suddenly its value goes up, because that's just how the luxury goods market works. You don't necessarily think that there may be an intersection there, but whether it's luxury foodstuffs or luxury products of other kinds, like beauty products or fabrics and textiles, there may be some innovation that enables value creation there. And don't poo-poo it. I actually have to say that more to my space colleagues than I do to folks outside of the space industry, because, you could sort of get pretty, I won't say limited in what you think the space industry can do, but rarely do people think about servicing segments of the economy that just, you're like, I can't relate to it. Like a lot of folks can't relate to the luxury goods industry. I actually think there's a prospect for some, not just innovation, but real value creation there. So I'd be curious to see what happens. And finally, I'll tell you what I'm really most excited about in the space industry is just the diversification of talent. It's been pretty much, it looks the same, it feels the same, it sounds the same. And make no mistake, I mean, yes, there has been some progress, but it's limited compared to other industries. What I'm hoping is 10 years from now, it's going to be incredibly creative, and it's going to pull on skill sets that are engineering plus. And that's probably one of the greatest messages for the folks that are listening, is that 10 years from now, we won't be talking about questions like, do you have to be an engineer or be super technically strong to have a meaningful impact in the space world?
I agree. I totally agree. Diversity, especially, is only one of the key ways you can bring creativity to an organization and figure out these kind of unusual things like luxury goods in space. It's certainly something I've never thought of, but there's clear benefits that diversity can continue to have on this industry. Well, it's been absolutely fantastic having you on the podcast. Thank you so much, and good luck to Space Tango.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emma, and good luck to you and all of your listeners too.